Welcome back to Film History, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. I'm literally the only person in the building right now. It is so quiet and creepy up here. I wish you guys were here instead of me just talking to this camera again. But we'll keep going on. Tonight we're going to talk about postmodern film. This is a really cool phase of film. There's a lot of interesting films to talk about. A lot of cool directors. I think you'll know a lot of the directors we're going to talk about with tonight's lecture. But let's get started by kind of establishing just what is postmodernism. And it's a really difficult thing to define. Maybe one of the easier ways to look at postmodernism is to first look at the modern age, which led up to it. The modern age, most people kind of consider it starting about 1850. That's when the second industrial revolution started kicking in. It's really at the height of the industrial revolution, so things are changing quite a bit in the world. This era is really marked by extraordinary creative output and originality. If you've taken art history classes, for example, maybe you've studied all the different art movements that were going on during this period, Impressionists and Cubists and Pointillists and abstract expressionism and all that stuff. And you see that in other art forms too, in literature and all that too. So it's extraordinarily original time in the creative world. Now, once we kind of get to the 1960s, we've already kind of talked about this when we talked about the American New Wave, how there's a lot of social upheaval going on, and that's not just in America, but in a lot of places around the world. Well, all this social unrest kind of leads to this rejection of the modern world, and we start going into what we call the postmodern era. And this is a difficult thing to define because postmodernism, by definition, is kind of an ambiguous thing. But maybe the best way to look at postmodernism is to look at maybe some aspects of what it is. So we're kind of maybe look at some characteristics of what makes something postmodernist. Now, not everything during this era, the time that we're in right now, is postmodern. I mean, there are still things that are more classically linked to more modern times. But there are a lot of films and other things, I think, that fit this definition pretty well. So just some characteristics we want to talk about. I think the easiest one to maybe recognize is the postmodern era has sometimes been called the Xerox age, and that's because there's a lot of copying going on where people are taking pre-existing work and just remaking it, revamping it. You see this, of course, with all the comic book genre stuff where you're seeing things kind of replicated over and over again. But then there's a lot of remakes as well, sequels and all that. It's just a time when I think it's hard to do something that's completely original anymore. I mean, often you've heard, I'm sure, people say there's only so many stories that can be told, and all we're doing now is just retelling the same story over and over again. There's some truth to that. Not to say that there can't be original things. I feel like Parasite, for example, was an extraordinarily original film, but still there's going to be elements in any film that are going to be pulled from other sources. So that's one major thing we look for in postmodernism. The second thing we look at is multiple genres being blended into one. This is pretty easy to see in the work of directors like Quentin Tarantino or the Coen brothers, where you watch a film like Pulp Fiction, for example, and you'll have a comic scene going on, and then suddenly it turns dark and violent. You put those things next to each other. That's pretty, I think, consistent in postmodern work, just not sticking to one genre, but having these things kind of blend together. The Coen brothers as well, like Bird After Reading, if you've seen that film. It's a very funny film, but then it becomes dark suddenly, and that's pretty standard for Coen brothers films. The heroes, if you think about maybe heroes during modern times, let's even go back to 40s and 50s. We look at heroes like John Wayne, and those characters are the Jimmy Stewart characters of the world who, they're clear cut, they're on the right side of morality, they stand for what is true and good. But once we get to the postmodern world, those heroes start to become a little bit more morally ambiguous, where sometimes they're doing some shady things. And I think that's pretty standard for what's going on with the postmodern hero. You also see a lot of characters who have maybe what we call superhuman abilities. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to be an action hero. It could be somebody like, in Hunger Games, where you take a seemingly normal girl, but then she becomes this almost superhuman figure in the way she kind of leads this revolution. So you see quite a bit of that with the heroes in postmodern film. Certainly, postmodernism is not a hopeful style. There's a lot of pessimism, there's a lot of detachment. Maybe we look at a film like Fight Club as an example of this one, where you see people just not fitting into the way the world works, feeling isolated from the world. And a lot of times this will lead to violence. You do see a lot of violence in a lot of postmodern films, where that's something that's maybe rejection of the world, or finding some way to cope with what's going on in the world, leading to violence. That's a pretty common aspect. And typically, the violence will be pretty realistic and gritty in postmodern films. And we'll talk about Quentin Tarantino later in more detail. He's a really good example of that. Another thing we want to talk about, and you see this in a lot of films, postmodern films, is this idea of constraint, where somebody is up against either a government or some other kind of authority that keeps them from doing what they want to do. Lots of good examples of this one. Maybe we talk about Minority Report for an example of this. If you've seen that film, that's a Spielberg film. You get this character who's basically accused of a crime that he has yet to commit, so people are after him to bring him to justice before he's even committed this crime. So you see him dealing with all this and trying to get out of this web of circumstances that he cannot control. The Matrix is a good example of that as well. There's a famous film called Brazil that deals with this idea of constraint. So you'll see this a lot in postmodernism. You'll also see this idea of technology coming up again and again. Technology is pretty accepted in the postmodern world. I mean, people, I think, like technology. I think they're good at it. In Matrix, of course, Neo, he's a really accomplished computer hacker, so he's very skilled at what he does. But there's also kind of the downside of technology. And Matrix is a good example of that as well, where the technology is this thing that's controlling people. People don't even really truly exist in the form that they think they exist. So you see kind of both sides of that play out in the postmodern world. Certainly, much more diversity in postmodernism. We look at the modern world, and things were pretty, I guess, isolated during that time. You think about back in the 1850s, nobody really traveled around. There was no television. It was hard to kind of have other cultures infiltrate each other. But now we're moving around. We have the internet, we have television. So cultures have become much more blended, and what that often does, it brings different ideas to different cultures, and then it becomes difficult at times to understand what's right, what's accepted in a culture, what's not accepted in a culture. It becomes more ambiguous, and I think postmodernism deals with this ambiguity quite a bit, to where there's not clarity anymore about what you should do in a certain situation, and that's dealt with a lot in postmodern film. Another thing we see, just this lack of sentimentality. You watch a lot of the classic British films, and there's a sentimentality to it. There's almost a sincerity to it. But in postmodern film, I think they don't take themselves so seriously. The Coen brothers are really good examples of this, where things become kind of cartoonish at times, and we don't want to look at something as authentically moving because maybe they don't believe in that. Maybe they don't believe that something can be truly beautiful or truly authentic. And I think that goes back to this idea of not knowing right from wrong, and it's not even that, it's more, there is no right and there's no wrong. And I think postmodern films will see that, and then they'll have a struggle maybe accepting the truth of a situation. So you see that quite a bit. And then lastly, just this idea of simulated realities, where the real world kind of takes a second place to what's going on in the simulated world. I don't know if you've ever saw a film called Her. It's a Spike Jonze film, came out within, I think, the last 5 years. Joaquin Phoenix was in it. And in this film, his character basically falls in love with his phone. So there's this romantic relationship, this intimate relationship between him and his phone. And you'll see that, I think, time and time again, where there's no authentic human connections a lot in postmodern work, where you're seeing a lot of intimacy take place in a simulated way as opposed in a real way. So those are just some of the characteristics. Again, it's hard to kind of put a real firm definition to what postmodernism is, but I think if you start looking for some of these characteristics in the films that you're watching, maybe this postmodern model will start to emerge a little bit. Let's take a peek at some of the key directors. Now I want to spend a lot more time talking about two directors, David Lynch and Quentin Tarantino. We're going to kind of get in depth with. And there's a lot of other postmodern directors that I didn't put on this list, but these are probably three of the more prominent directors you might check out. The Coen brothers, of course, they're great. Everybody's seen the Coen brothers, and they've worked in a variety of genres over the years. Very technically proficient filmmakers. I mean, their films are skillfully shot, great sound design, great production design. They just have a really cool look to them. They tend to have kind of a pessimistic look at the world. They kind of see this randomness, I think, to things at times, and people kind of searching for meaning in this randomness. But the Coen brothers, they're so all over the place, I think, from genre to location that they shoot. It's hard to kind of pinpoint real specific themes that permeate their work because they are so all over the place. I think as far as checking out their work, you've probably seen a lot of their classic films, Fargo, No Country for Old Men. I put this one up on the screen, Barton Fink, just because I think probably a lot of you have not seen this film, and I think it's a really good example of their postmodern style. Big Lebowski is another really good postmodern film because it really kind of rips apart the conceptions of genre. So maybe check out Barton Fink if you get a chance. I think it's a really interesting, different film that you might not have seen from them before. This other director you see here, Terry Gilliam, that's probably a director you haven't heard of. He was working more prominently in the early stages of kind of postmodern film back in the 80s. If you're a Monty Python fan, or if you've ever heard of Monty Python, he was one of the founding members of that comedy group, that British comedy group. And then he went on to make films, and one of the classic films he made was a film called Brazil. And it's kind of like a 1984 remake in a way. It's got this real dystopian look to it, this mixing of new and old, and everything's kind of crumbling and falling apart. And you get this person stuck in this situation that they can't get out of. It's a really unique cinematic experience. And those are themes that he deals with a lot in his other films. A film like 12 Monkeys, for example, with Bruce Willis. You see this kind of same character stuck in this situation that he can't get out of, this kind of crumbling world. great production design in Terry Gilliam films. Got a really cool look. The other one I put up here is a very famous director, Christopher Nolan. Most people know him from the Batman trilogy, of course, but really some of his other films I think are extremely interesting and kind of trippy, right? I mean, films like Memento, The Prestige, Inception, Interstellar, I mean, they all have this, I think, depth to them. He's really exploring the nature of time, of memory, and he wants to go really deep into those things, but he does it within kind of these entertaining, big budget structures, which is very fascinating to me. The fact that he can pull this off on such a big scale. I think what allows him to do that is that he is able to keep these big ideas extremely engaging as he approaches them. So I think that's what makes it work for him. So those are just three that I wanted to mention. But we're going to dig in deeper to a couple other directors. Just some of the key films in the postmodern age. A lot of people look to Blade Runner as the first truly postmodern film. That's the film we're going to be watching for this week. That's a Ridley Scott film. And Ridley Scott's a fantastic director who's been around for a long time. Films like Alien and Gladiator and The Martian more recently. So Blade Runner is, I think, a great example of kind of that postmodern style that we've been talking about. Some other films to check out. A German film is really interesting called Run Lola Run. That one's got almost like this video game feel to it. That would be one worth checking out. Fight Club, I think, is a great example of postmodernism. David Fincher has a lot of postmodern elements to him, just in the themes that he's dealing with quite a bit, the style of his work. He's a good example of a postmodern filmmaker. The one I put there at the bottom, that's Her. That's a really cool film. If you like Spike Jonze's work, he's made films like Being John Malkovich and Adaptation. I think that's a really interesting film that kind of picks apart the nature of modern relationships. And then the picture you see there, that's a still from Brazil. I really highly recommend you check out that film just because it's got such a cool look. It's just a unique kind of film experience if you get a chance to check that one out. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with one of the two directors I wanted to kind of dig into a little deeper, and that's David Lynch. Now, some of you might see his face and you say, that's the guy who talks to monkeys. Maybe you've seen that on Netflix. He's done a lot more than talk to monkeys. He's been around since the 70s making films, and he's had a pretty prolific career. Again, staying active as a filmmaker even today. Extremely interesting filmmaker. Just a unique visionary. There are no films like David Lynch films. If you've seen one, you kind of understand what I'm talking about. There's just a world that he creates that's unlike the world of any other filmmaker. So let's kind of dig into some of the things that obsess David Lynch. And there's a lot of things that obsess him. First, he comes from a small town, and he deals with this quite a bit, where he'll take ordinary settings. He likes to deal a lot with small town settings. But within that small town, there's going to be something that's kind of hidden and dark beneath the surface. It may all appear to be everybody's nice and good, but if you dig deeper, there's a real kind of evil lurking underneath the surface. And I'm going to show you a clip. I'll show you a clip here in a second of the beginning of Blue Velvet that really kind of illustrates his philosophy on this in just one kind of really well-crafted sequence. He's also big kind of digging into kind of our fears. He really wants to get inside people's heads. He's fascinated with the subconscious fears that we have. And you can kind of guess this is going to take his films into some really dark places at times, very dark places. His films can be hard to watch. Some really visceral violence, very, just sudden, dark violence. And probably more disturbing is kind of this sexual violence that happens quite a bit, that's kind of lurking in the underbelly of his characters. So it can make his films difficult to watch. There's certain films especially that you might want to approach with caution. Also, this idea of doubling, of metamorphosis, of characters who have their doppelgangers out there, their kind of evil twin, and there's this lot of where characters are kind of becoming like that evil side, getting pulled into that darkness. You see characters who seem normal and good, and then they just get pulled into something that they don't want to get pulled into, and it's kind of out of their control. So those are some major themes for Lynch. As far as stylistics, he's just got some interesting things he likes to deal with. It's shocking to me at times that David Lynch has had any commercial success, because his films can be so abstract and experimental at times, but he's really had a pretty commercially successful career. But he loves to kind of blend the dream world with reality. You'll see this time and time again. If you've ever seen the TV show Twin Peaks, you'll kind of know what we're talking about here, this kind of blending of those two worlds. And sometimes you don't know what's what, if it's a dream or if it's reality. Other things that he'll do, his imagery, very striking imagery. I mean, disturbing imagery at times, but certainly imagery that sticks with you. Vivid colors, a lot of dark kind of colors blended with dark shadows. Again, that probably makes sense because of the dark subject matter that his films deal with. He's got great sound in his films. He does spend a lot of time on sound. He's got these really beautiful film scores. He's worked with the same composer for a lot of his films. But he does a lot of what we call abstract sound, where sounds are not realistic, but they're kind of more symbolic in what they're trying to achieve. And you'll see some examples of that in the clip I'm going to show you. Some other things you might see, he's got this kind of fascination with shots that seem to kind of want to probe through darkness. And it makes sense, right? Because I feel like his stories are a journey into darkness, and that kind of visually works for what he's trying to accomplish. Okay, let me show you a quick clip. This is from his most famous film, Blue Velvet. And this is actually the very beginning scene of Blue Velvet. So this is the very opening of the film.
She wore blue velvet, bluer than velvet was the night, softer than satin was the light from the stars. She wore bluer than velvet were her eyes, warmer than May her tender sighs. Love was on. Eyes of light of diamond, feeling the rapture grow.
see in that clip from Lynch there and from Blue Velvet, just that idea of darkness hidden beneath the surface of the ordinary, right? In fact, here's a quote from Lynch that really illustrates that last image you saw, right? Where we're seeing this scene of normalcy, somebody just there watching television, watering the lawn, kids going to school, but then we dig deeper underneath the surface into the grass, into the dirt, and there's all these dark beetles clawing and fighting each other. That's David Lynch right there. Just the darkness that's kind of underneath everything. Some of his key films. Personally, I think Blue Velvet is his masterpiece. And again, it's a difficult film to watch, but it's just one of the most intriguing films I've ever seen. I will give you this warning: do not watch this film with your mother. I was stupid when I was young. I said, I really want to see Blue Velvet. So my mom and I watched it. This is not the film to watch with mom. I will say that right now. Don't do it. Some of his other films that you might want to check out. A lot of people like Mulholland Drive. I don't think it's as good as Blue Velvet, but a lot of people put that higher than Blue Velvet. So you might want to check that one out. Of course, his TV show Twin Peaks. A lot of people love that. His first film's Eraserhead. That is a real trip to watch. I don't know if I can recommend it for everyone, but I think some of you would really be fascinated by that film. Probably his most normal film is The Elephant Man. It's just a pretty standard film with some kind of David Lynch touches, but for me that's a really kind of moving, emotional film that's worth seeing. You'll see one of his main actors, Kyle MacLachlan. A lot of people have said that Kyle MacLachlan looks like David Lynch, so he has kind of become his alter ego on screen. There's probably some truth to that. He works a lot with Laura Dern as well. She's been in a lot of his films, so he does have kind of this set company of people he likes to work with again and again. Okay, the other director I want to talk about, probably either you love or hate this guy. Some of you might have gone to film school because you saw Pulp Fiction when you were young, or he was the person who really inspired you to want to become a filmmaker. Quentin Tarantino has certainly touched everybody in some way. I mean, I think most of us have seen a film by him at some point. He can be a very divisive figure at times, but he's certainly probably one of the most important American filmmakers to come along in a while. His body of work does kind of attest to that. Some themes that you'll see a lot. I mean, if you've seen a Quentin Tarantino film, you're going to expect to see violence, very cinematic violence. His violence is really not intended to be realistic, and I don't think he would ever even say that he wants his violence to be realistic. He wants it to be overly bloody, overly gory, because he feels like that's entertaining. And it's not just always violence for the sake of violence. I think at times it is, to be truthful. I think, the Crazy 88 or whatever that scene was called in Kill Bill was pretty much just a ballet of violence. But I think there are times when he uses violence for thematic purpose. I think there are characters who need to, like you see here, have some kind of redemption. And maybe that redemption, the only way you can get it is through violence. Revenge is a big kind of driving theme in his work. You see films like, Kill Bill, of course, Inglourious Bastards, other films where people have been wronged, at times horribly wronged, and they need to get retribution for that. That's the thing that drives them. Django Unchained is another good example of this. So a lot of times this is going to be a motivating factor for his characters, and it'll be a plot device as well. I don't know if you know about his background much, but Quentin Tarantino, kind of started as a video clerk. He worked at a video store, and he spent a lot of his free time just simply watching movies. And he didn't gravitate towards kind of the standard films. He liked the B movies, kind of the trashy movies. And it wasn't just American B movies. He loved Asian B movies as well. And you see the influence of that in his work. A lot of people have accused him at times of taking stories from other films, remaking other stories, and I think he would actually admit that that's truthful. But I think everybody, absorbs the things around them and kind of tries to find ways to make that their own. So I think that's just more probably of an influence as opposed to just out and out stealing. But certainly if you watch some of his films and trace it back to the roots of some of the films he watched, there probably would be a lot of similarities there. From a stylistic standpoint, I think a lot of times when you think of Quentin Tarantino, you think of the structure of his films, certainly always kind of bouncing around, very non-linear. Pulp Fiction, it's all rearranged, and really almost all of his films have a pretty unstructured structure to it. And that's purposeful. And that's because I think a lot of times for him, the climax of the film doesn't necessarily come at the end of the given story. It comes somewhere in the middle, and that's why we have to save that for the end of the film. Another thing I'm sure you think about with Tarantino is his use of dialogue. He is pretty brilliant at writing dialogue, and he is known for writing these huge monologues. Inglourious Basterds starts off with just this page after page monologue, and it's, for the most part, very effective. There can be times when he can be indulgent, I think, with his dialogue and let it go on too much, but I think that's part of kind of his style, I guess part of his brand, if you want to put it that way. And there's a rhythm to that dialogue. He puts a lot of pulp culture references into his dialogue. And a lot of times the dialogue seems to be purposeless, but it does tend to eventually lead to some point and have some reason for being there. And plus, just sometimes it's interesting and entertaining to listen to the people in his films talk. His films are certainly about entertainment, right? So I think there's nothing wrong with the way he handles that. Some other things, I don't know if you know what a Mexican standoff is. Typically when you think of that, it's three people in a circle, each one is holding a gun at the other one, so you have this kind of standoff. He's got this show up in a lot of his films. He's got a strange foot fetish that unfortunately shows itself in, I think, every film. He has close-ups of feet. So if you're not into feet, don't see a Tarantino film. He's got that POV shot that you see on the screen there. I don't know if he's the one who invented that, but he's certainly the one who uses it a lot. I think every single film of his has some kind of variation on the POV camera in the trunk shot. He's also great with music too. He really blends music. He loves kind of classic rock music, so you'll see that kind of peek into his films quite a bit. And he blends it really well with the editing. This quote kind of says it all about Tarantino. Violence is really the thing that drives him. He's really unapologetic about this, and it just permeates everything he does. Again, I think just for the cinematic value, if for nothing else. Some films to check out. Probably most people would consider Pulp Fiction to be his masterpiece. I'm sure that's debatable, but I think that's pretty well regarded as his best film. Reservoir Dogs was a great debut for him. He made that film after selling the scripts for True Romance and Natural Born Killers. That's the thing that got him the chance to make Reservoir Dogs in the first place, and that jettisoned his career from there. Other films, Kill Bill, Jackie Brown, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which I've already told you, I'm not a big fan of that film, but he's got a really good body of work. It's hard to imagine a Quentin Tarantino film without Samuel L. Jackson. He's been in a lot of his films, not all of them, but a lot of them. And he works with a lot of other people too. He's got the same producer, Lawrence Bender, that I think he's worked with on every film. And he works with the same DPs quite a bit. Robert Richardson is somebody he likes to work with. Let me show you a clip from Tarantino. Again, this is probably one you've seen before. This is a clip from Pulp Fiction, but just in case you've never seen a Tarantino film, here is a little taste of it.
Okay, so tell me again about the hash bar.
Okay, what you want to know?
Hash is legal, right?
That's legal, but ain't 100% legal. You just can't walk into a restaurant, roll a joint, and start puffing away. I mean, they want you to smoke in your home or certain designated places.
And those are hash bars.
Yeah, it breaks down like this. Okay, it's legal to buy it, it's legal to own it, and if you're the proprietor of a hash bar, it's legal to sell it. It's legal to carry it, but that doesn't matter. Just get over this. All right. If you get stopped by a cop in Amsterdam, it's illegal for them to search you. I mean, that's the right that cops in Amsterdam don't have.
Oh man, I'm going. That's all it is to it. I'm fucking going.
No, baby, you think you're the most. But you know what the funniest thing about Europe is?
What?
It's a little different. I mean, they got the same shit over there they got here, but it's just there, it's a little different.
Example.
All right, when you can walk into a movie theater in Amsterdam and buy a beer. And I don't mean just like, paper cup, I'm talking about a glass of beer. And in Paris, you can buy beer at McDonald's. And you know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Paris?
They don't call it a quarter pounder with cheese?
I mean, they got a metric system. It was no fucking quarter pounder is.
And what do they call it?
They call it a Royale with cheese.
Royale with cheese.
That's right.
What do they call a Big Mac?
Big Mac's a Big Mac, but they call it Le Big Mac.
Big Mac. What do they call a Whopper?
I don't know, I can go on Burger King. You know what they put on French fries in Holland instead of ketchup?
What?
Mayonnaise. I seen them do it, man. They fucking drown with that shit.
We should have shotguns with this on the deal.
How many up there?
3 or 4.
That's counting that guy?
Not sure.
So that means it could be up to 5 guys up there?
It's possible.
We should have fucking shotguns.
So there you see a lot of the stylistic things we were talking about with Tarantino, right? You see the POV in the trunk shot there at the end. You certainly get a taste of his well-crafted dialogue, kind of the blending of comic and dramatic or violent with these hitmen talking about royales with cheese, but then, hey, we're gonna go kill somebody. So that's a little bit of what you get from Tarantino, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of his work before. Okay, so that's it for Postmodern Film. The film we're gonna watch this week is Blade Runner. This should be, again, available through CMO streaming. I think it's also on Netflix right now, if that's easier for you. You should see a version that says Blade Runner, the final cut. That's the one we're looking for, so try to find that one when you watch it. Again, I hope everybody's doing well. I miss seeing all of you. Take care. Send me a message if you ever need anything. See you next time.